My name is Blase. I am a final year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon. I'm working with my advisor, Lori Craner. We're trying to provide users data-driven privacy awareness. We're doing this in the space of online behavioral advertising. That is the tailoring of advertisements based on web pages a user has visited. And I'll give a very brief overview of how this works for those of you who aren't familiar. So let's say I'm a user and I'm browsing to a web page, perhaps bicycle.com. So on bicycle.com, the advertisements aren't provided by bicycle.com. Essentially, you have these third parties who are taking the space and presenting the advertisements. So let's say I open up a fresh instance of a browser, clear all of my cookies and everything. This is the first time this advertiser seems to have seen this instance of my browser. So they drop a cookie. They come up with a unique identifier for me, save this cookie. And they note, I've been to bicycle.com. Then later, let's say I go to another web page, like a Vital BMX web page. And again, this third-party advertiser is presenting the advertisement to me. And the same cookie from before is still there. So now this advertiser can know, well, I've been to bicycle.com and Vital BMX. Right. They conclude, I think you like bicycles. So then later, on an unrelated site, perhaps weather.com or Weather Channel, again, this advertiser's coming, and they have to go provide an ad for me. They look at my cookie and say, this is the person who we think likes bicycles. So they decide to show me a bicycle ad. They're targeting this advertisement to me based on my past web browsing. And hundreds of advertising networks, from Google to BlueKai, engage in this because users like relevant ads. Right? Doesn't it make more sense to show some user something they're interested in rather than something they're not? Right? And there are many tracking methods, everything from cookies to browser fingerprinting, super cookies. There's been lots of research and essentially the mechanics of how it works, and in fact, lots of ongoing research into the mechanics. Right? And so we've been looking at this users' preferences of OBA for a number of years. And what's really interesting here is that there are a lot of pros and cons we are implicitly asking users to weigh. Right? So we, about 3 years ago, conducted a study that we decided to call Smart, Useful, Scary, Creepy, based on what we had learned. This was an interview study where we interviewed dozens of users about their perceptions of online behavioral advertising. And what we found is, well, the useful part is that users like receiving relevant advertising. They find it useful for them to see ads for things they actually might buy. They're excited to get deals. They're excited to find out about new products. Right? And they, of course, think it's also smart that advertising networks do this and show them relevant ads. Right? On the other hand, they find the online tracking that happens to present them with the relevant ads kind of creepy. Sometimes a little bit creepy, sometimes very creepy. Right? So at this point, users have to weigh, well, I like the relevant ads. I don't really like this tracking. I find it creepy. Right? And they're really left conflicted and confused. Right? How do I weigh this pro versus this con? And one of the complicating factors here is that they really had a lot of trouble understanding how this happened. How do they know that I like bicycles? And if you think about it, the process of behavioral targeting, making these inferences, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Right? So first, when we asked users their understanding about how this tracking occurs, it was really like magic to most of these average users. Right? So then we showed them a video from Wall Street Journal's a really nice article, a really nice video, and they learned about how cookies are used, learned that cookies are also used for shopping carts, and then our users were starting to get confused and say like, oh, well, now my credit card's stored in my cookies because it's used for my shopping cart, it's used for this targeted advertising, and they're getting worried about hackers getting into their cookies, which, technical people, we know, well, that's not what's generally happening, right? But so they're left very conflicted and confused, and they really have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. So how can we provide transparency? I'll get back to that in a moment. Right. So let's say a user wants to take some action. What are their options right now for privacy? Well, one thing is they can go to the advertising network's opt-out pages and click opt-out. They can send the do not track signal, which we've all seen W3C debating and starting to coalesce around. There's also a number of browser extensions. This is actually a very incomplete list. Things like Ghostery, Privacy Badger, Disconnect, Blur. Right? And these privacy tools, in fact, are things I use, they do a number of really cool things. They have a list of third-party domains, and they can block the request to these domains. Right? That's cool. They also try to help users understand what's going on. That's also cool. Right? But I think we can go a lot further there. So one problem with these privacy plugins is poor usability. Also a couple years ago, Lori and I and some of our colleagues conducted a study that we called Why Johnny Can't Opt Out, where we did a usability study of how average users who are interested in protecting their privacy are able to, or unable to, as the case turned out to be, use these privacy tools. And we found a lot of really major configuration errors, things like users thinking they had configured a tool to block third-party tracking, and they actually had not even turned the tool on. Right? And so thankfully, a lot of the companies whose tools we evaluated in this study have made really great improvements. There's still much more room for improvement, but it's getting better. Another problem is what we believe to be a conceptual shortcoming of how they're communicating with users. And thanks to the Data Transparency Lab, that's what we're now trying to address. Okay? So kind of to abstract it away a little bit, the way current tools work, the ones I listed, is generally as you're browsing, in addition to behind the scenes blocking these requests of these third-party domains, they're popping up these little boxes on your screen saying things like, here are the companies that are currently tracking you. Right? And so that's cool. Users see these, they see like, wow, this is so surprising that all these companies are tracking me. And the thing is, some of these companies are things they've heard of. Like they've heard of Google. They know that's their email provider. That's their search engine. Right? But we actually found in some of our user studies that I mentioned, users are a little confused why Google's popping up here. I'd like to quote one user who, in an interview with me, was like, you know, I've never really thought of Google as an advertising company. Oh, that's interesting. I managed to keep a straight face in that interview and tried to learn more. Right? So they're confused, why is Google showing up? They're also confused, well, these companies, Blue Kai, Chartbeat, Dynamic Yield, well, who are they? And what do they know about me? And the second question, what do they know about me, is what's really interesting to Lori and me right now. How do we provide transparency? Right. And so building on kind of our research and what other people, both in this room and not in this room, are doing, we're working on a browser extension to do two things. One is show users what's been tracked and estimate what may have been inferred. Right? And there's lots of technical complexity to both these questions and lots of opportunity for helping users, presenting to them in an intelligible way what's going on with these. And I'll dive a little bit into that right now. Right, so showing users what has been tracked. Well, wouldn't it be perhaps more interesting, perhaps not more interesting, this is something we can test, if we showed users, well, these companies, rather than saying these companies that you've never heard of, they're tracking you right now, what if we told them what they've tracked about them? Right? We could tell them, hey, Dynamic Yield knows you visited the Pittsburgh Penguins 2015 preview, which was a lot of optimism that's since been crushed. You've been visiting Pittsburgh for vegetarians, right? So, well, how do we do this? Well, one thing we can do is store this locally. So we're working first on a Chrome plugin. Later, we're going to be extending this to a Firefox plugin. We're writing to local storage, essentially what page they were on when different third parties were present. And so, at least for this initial step of data collection, we're recording locally on their machine. Well, we're tracking the trackers. We're recording what has been tracked about them. Right? And we're interested in essentially what impact that has on users. Right? The second part is actually, I think, what's more exciting to me and Lori, and also far more difficult technically, and also far more contentious. Right? So based on your visits to the following page, Dynamic Yield has likely concluded that you like ice hockey and vegetarian restaurants. Right? What if we could show people that? Wouldn't that be cool? And that's what we're doing. Right? So how do we get there? Well, there's lots of different ways. And as we heard earlier this morning, we often really don't know what these third-party advertisers are doing with the data they're collecting. Right? But we can start making guesses. And we can, in fact, try lots of different guesses about what they're doing and seeing how this impacts users. Right? So one thing we could do is ask all these companies, can you please tell us exactly what you're doing? They're not going to tell us. These are, for the most part, trade secrets. We could also say, please tell us what you're doing. Please, please. Like we'll give you like a cupcake. That's also not going to work. Right. So what we're, as our first step doing, is we took a list of Google's ad interest categories, and we matched each of these ad interest categories to a Wikipedia page that is relevant to that category, or in some cases multiple pages. using this to determine keywords that are likely associated with that ad interest category using the NLP term frequency inverse document frequency, TF-IDF technique, right? And from that, we're essentially tracking locally what the frequency that these keywords have shown up in the body of web pages as users have seen while browsing. And so this is essentially one of many, many, many possible ways we could essentially make our own inferences about third parties' inferences. And also, this is our first step in the project. I'm very interested to talk to all of you here who are doing a lot more reverse engineering of third-party tracking and inferences to see how we can collaborate. Right. And so what we're doing is, with this plugin over the next few months, we're interested in answering a couple of research questions. We're interested, does this tool improve users' awareness? Are we successfully educating them about what's actually happening in online behavioral advertising and with this tracking online? Does this tool impact users' attitudes? And you can imagine this going in both directions. Perhaps, on the one hand, you might have users see, well, this is what's being tracked about me. This isn't my credit card number. This isn't my social security number. Maybe this actually makes me more okay with this if I know that that's the only thing that's being tracked, right? Of course, we don't know as a community whether that's the only thing that's being tracked, but it gives us some ground truth or some understanding into the user's perceptions, right? On the other hand, users might see what's being tracked and say, before I thought this was a little creepy in the abstract, now I know this is really creepy. Right? But we're just really interested in providing transparency and empowering users with as much information as they can have to make these decisions. And then ultimately, we're interested in how this tool impacts users' behaviors. Are they more or less likely to block third-party tracking, perhaps even block all ads, stop browsing? There's many different outcomes, and we're interested essentially in what happens when we provide this transparency. So to do this, we're ramping up to, in the late winter and early spring, conduct a 2-week field trial with 75 participants, where we give them our plugin, let them browse organically for 2 weeks, and then basically measure what happens in a number of different variants of this tool. Right? And so thank you very much, and thanks to the Data Transparency Lab for supporting this project, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you for the talk. I have 2 quick questions. The first is, how do you identify third-party trackers? Are you using one of the lists that the other tools are using?
Yeah, we're using currently the disconnect list.
Okay. And the second question is, if you have or if you're planning to essentially tap into the browser so that if the user, for example, deletes our cookies, then you should also forget that he went to the Penguin website or whatever it was.
Right, exactly. So that's a great point, and I think it's actually important for 2 reasons. One is, for the accuracy of what we're presenting to them, and the second is actually for the user's own privacy. So it's there's an implicit assumption in our tool that it's a single user using this machine, this browser instance, and so we don't want to, of course, cause privacy leaks as a result of this tool. But we are in fact doing that. But thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Blase. My name is Benjamin Dean. I'm a fellow at Columbia University. I do research on the economics of information. A quick question about kind of reverse engineering this process of inference. Are you finding, so this is a great slide as an example, when people are searching something like Pittsburgh for vegetarians, they're not actually vegetarians, or they don't live in Pittsburgh, or we're inferring the wrong thing from their actions. And I wonder if, does this explain, I value your comments on that, and whether this kind of starts chipping away at how valuable is this inference process, really? Have you found any of that in the research?
Right. Yeah. So I guess we're still in the process of building this plugin, so we don't have the data from this particular instance. But this idea did come up quite frequently in the interviews we've conducted in the past, building up to this work. And so, as Lori and I are both from the security and privacy and HCI communities initially, and so we came to this saying, well, this tracking, it's going to raise privacy concerns. And what was surprising to us is that, along with the idea of, I don't want this data being collected about me, a lot of our users were concerned, this company is getting the wrong opinion of me, which is exactly the point you're making. What if this company is concluding that you're a vegetarian in Pittsburgh, when you, in fact, are a carnivore in New York, right? And so, what impact does that have? And we found in these qualitative interviews, a lot of users are worried about being incorrectly profiled. They would actually, in some cases, they would actually rather be correctly profiled than either incorrectly profiled or not profiled at all. And a lot of it stems to this very complicated value proposition. How are you weighing the pros and cons? But I think what it really reduces to is, well, this is what's happening, and we want to provide transparency. If we can provide transparency about what we believe is happening, or in fact what is happening, even if the inferences that are being made are wrong, even though I've looked at, for instance, Google's privacy dashboard and it has my demographics all wrong. So we just want to provide transparency and see what impact that has. But it's wrongly profiling people is a major concern for a lot of people. Yes.
Tom Candela, Research Pays. I'm a freelance writer. Based on what you said, what do people say that are upset, about being tracked? In other words, let me rephrase that. What benefit do they get for being tracked? All I heard so far was relevant ads and deals. So is that it? Is there more?
From our interviews and our other work, a lot of it is relevant ads and deals. And for me, I guess coming into these projects, for me, relevant ads and deals aren't a big deal to me. But for a lot of the people who've come into our lab and talked to us and use these privacy tools, they've said relevant ads and deals mean a lot to me.
So they weren't, when they expressed to you that they were upset that the information was wrong, it was all because the deals that they're missing? Or was there something else?
There was something else.
Okay.
So actually, one of the interesting examples was we had one of our user study or interview participants taught essentially law dealing with very sensitive topics, including sexual assault and rape, and so spent a lot of time searching for these things and was worried that her profiles online were misrepresenting her in that particular way. And she was like, I'm not interested in rape and serial killers. This is just my professional life. And so there were absolutely those privacy concerns and many others too. But I think that probably touches at your point.
There was one more. Yes, I'm trying to understand how you think about this in light of sort of typical marketing psychographic inferences, where I once worked at a company where I could tell them, 2 types of music I listened to, and then they were predicting the kind of car I was going to drive. And so how do you contrast that type of psychographic stuff with what you're researching here?
Right, yeah, so I think that, there are many ways of making inferences about people, and there's essentially, if we go back out to the idea of big data, there's, things that one might superficially not realize are connected are actually deeply connected, and, again, it's what's happening actually in the advertising world to us up in the ivory tower is sometimes pretty opaque, and also, ideally, we would love to model these kinds of things, and we'd love to make strategic partnerships to do this. In kind of our limited circumstance right now, we're saying, well, what's the best we can do with what we have? We don't have big data. We don't even have medium data. We just have a little bit of data. And so I think, ultimately, you're trying to model as accurately as possible what happens behind the scenes is really where we'd want to go. But the first step is trying to understand, well, if we can get a little bit of the way there, how is this impacting users' thinking, users' attitudes, users' behaviors?
I wonder about the delivery method. I'm going toward a different aspect. You're creating a plugin, right?
Right.
What are the advantages of having a plugin rather than always browsing in privacy mode? Because Ghostery, for example, there's a lot of criticism on Ghostery because they are actually advertisement companies. So it's weird that you're installing another tracker on your browser instead of getting rid of all the trackers.
Right. Yeah, that's a great concern. So among all of the possible architectures we considered were things like, well, wouldn't it be interesting for instance, in our user study, or as we're using the tools to actually perform our own measurements and be collecting data about users. And we actually decided we actually don't want to see any of their data. So that's why we decided to store all of the tracking of the trackers we do, we store locally on their machine. We never send to a server. So in the instance of our particular browser extension, we're not just sending this to us. I think you raise an interesting kind of meta point about what is the right way to solve privacy, what's the right way to solve transparency online, and I guess for many users there's also a pro versus con relationship in if you're always in private browsing mode or always you're clearing your browser state. Well, you lose some of these benefits of your browser remembering you or remembering things you've typed in, which is a negative for some users, positive for others. And I think really what we're aiming at is helping and empowering users to understand the implications, understand what's actually happening, and help them make educated decisions.
I hate to stop this. We'll take one more
All right.
question.
Okay, last
And I
question.
would absolutely, encourage you to continue to talk with Blase. We'll be here for a day and a half for that. So
Okay.
I'm so glad there's so many questions. Please go ahead.
Dowd Gordon from 2 Cents. So I really like the concept of allowing users to track themselves and then showing them what somebody else can understand about the individual by mining that data. But I think a really important aspect of that is really difficult to quantify is at a certain point having a historical trace of time series data of an individual, should it be events or locations, eventually leads towards de-anonymization of the individual. And as soon as you can uniquely identify an individual, then there are tons of services from data brokers that allow you to do profile completion. And if you guys have thought about any way to help a user understand that what a data set that somebody else has on them, how close somebody could be getting to the point where they can de-anonymize a user, because as soon as that happens, profile matching, it just becomes an entirely different animal. That's no longer about what can they infer about me. But then, the visiting a vegetarian website tells them so much more about you if they know that you're a carnivore that lives in New York because Experian has told them that.
Mm-hmm. Right, yes, I think you're getting at, as we heard from Sandy earlier this morning, understanding what is actually happening, what are they doing with the data, what's happening behind the scenes is, I think, a very important yet very open question for our Data Transparency Lab community. And I have no particular special insight into this right now, but I hope to continue this conversation with a lot of you here over the next day and a half and well into the future.